In an observational study, you simply observe a sample and take measurements. No action is taken to affect those measurements. So there's two big types of observational study. In this category, surveys. Like if you just ask people their opinion or ask people facts about their life, you're not actually doing anything to the people you are surveying. Or would kind of invalidate the survey. The other thing is called a retrospective study. Which means events have already happened, data has already been collected somehow, and you're just going back through and analyzing the data. So an example of this might be like hospitals keep pretty good records of like everybody's diagnoses, everybody's, comorbidities, and, when they were admitted, when they died, when they were released, whatever. So all of this data being out there somewhere means that some statistician could go back through all of that data and kind of analyze it, get some meaning from it, make some conclusions, calculate some statistics, and so on. So that would be a retrospective study. In contrast, a designed experiment means that you are actually doing something to your subjects or doing something to your experimental units in order to affect some kind of change. And then when you take measurements, you're trying to measure the change that you're bringing about in the experiment. So exercise 1, the University of Texas polls residents of Austin, Texas about which presidential candidate they prefer. Is this an observational study or designed experiment? Eli. Observational. Yeah, we are just observing by giving them a survey what their opinion is. We're not actually doing anything to them to change their mind. Okay. A researcher wants to know whether the supplement something something is effective in increasing the lifespan of mice. If we want to answer this question, is that going to require an observational study or a designed experiment? Sarah? Yeah, because we're actually going to have to do something to the mice. Some of the mice we're going to keep as a control group, and the rest of the mice we are going to give them this supplement, and we're going to measure their lifespan. And we hope maybe that the group receiving the supplement will have a different lifespan than the control group, and we can measure the difference. Okay. Without reading what's on the page, would you be surprised to know that smoking actually could reduce your chance of all-cause mortality? So they conducted this study back in 1996, and this was only adult women in the sample. And what are we looking at? Some of the people in the sample were smokers and some were not smokers. They got this roster of people together at the beginning of a 10-year period, and then 10 years later, they followed up and tried to find the same women and find out if they were alive or dead 10 years later, right? And you would think that smoking would increase your chances of dying in those 10 years, right, in that 10-year period. That's what I would expect. So we have a total dead, a total alive, a total number of participants in each category. And then when it says odds of death, this calculation is just 139 divided by 443. That's what an odds is. It's not the same thing as probability. And then likewise, the odds of death here are 230 over 502, which gives you 458. Notice that the odds of death are higher for the no smoking status than they were for the smoking status. And these aren't made up numbers, but this is actually data gathered by, statisticians at some point in history, some point a few decades ago. And you're like, man, that sounds really counterintuitive. It is. This is what it looks like now if instead of considering the entire group of smokers and the entire group of non-smokers together, if we categorize them by age group, right? We look at all of the 18 to 34-year-olds who are smokers and non-smokers. We look at all the 35 to 54-year-olds who are smokers and non-smokers and so on. And when you break them up by age group, what you actually find is that it's better to not be a smoker. It makes more sense to us. When this says OR here, it's called odds ratio. The OR stands for odds ratio, and we also have the odds ratio here. When it says odds ratio, it's saying, let's take 0.314 divided by 0.458 to get 0.658. So this number is less than 1 if it's better to be a smoker. And it's greater than 1 if it's better to be a non-smoker. And so sure enough, when we actually break it up by age category, the same data from the same data set in the same study shows that the odds ratio is always greater than 1, which means you're better off being a non-smoker. So what happened? The only way this happens is if the smoking group had younger participants than the non-smoking group. So if you recruit a bunch of old people to be your non-smokers and a bunch of young people to be your smokers, the old people are going to die in higher rates versus the young people. This is called a confounding variable. Age group of participant is the confounding variable here. Whenever you see the trend reverse, like the odds ratio reverse versus, the total data set versus controlling for the confounding variable, that phenomenon is called Simpson's paradox, what we just observed here. But the actual thing, the actual reason for Simpson's paradox is called the confounding variable. In this case, the age of the participant is a confounding variable that was making it hard to make a valid conclusion about smoking and non-smoking and its effect on all-cause mortality. So a confounding variable is a separate factor influencing the result of a study or experiment. It will invalidate your data. You will get the wrong conclusion if you don't acknowledge that variable and effectively separate it. And you can do this either with good experiment design practices, which we'll talk about here in a second, or really fancy mathematics. One of the big things you should take away from this Intro to Statistics class, because this is just a first semester in statistics. You could study statistics for years and years and years. One of the things I want you to remember as you're going to go off and go to grad school and study whatever the heck you're going to study, medicine or science or whatever, is like, talk to statisticians. You know what I mean? It's always nice to have an interdisciplinary team of people working on research. Yesterday I was talking with a statistician who worked at a neuroscience clinic where they were doing testing on whether or not certain lifestyle changes made a significant difference in the rate of onset for Alzheimer's among the Down syndrome population. And that's good. I'm glad that they employ a statistician because sometimes you just need somebody who's an expert in the field. So really, at a university, if you're doing some kind of like PhD research, you're doing some kind of dissertation, don't try to plan the experiment by yourself. Don't try to analyze the data by yourself. Like, go talk to somebody who knows. Universities are full of people with a PhD in statistics, so just got to find them. Okay. So there are fancy ways of getting rid of confounding variables, but we'll talk about how to design your experiment well. Exercise 2. An article is published claiming that drinking coffee will extend your lifespan. This is based on evidence from an observational study. It's based on a survey. I've got the link to it if you wanted to read it from my lecture notes later. But what are some possible confounding variables in this situation, Hunter? I mean, if you gathered a bunch of data, you get a sample together, and you ask them, how much coffee do you drink, and how old are you, right? How old are people living when they drink coffee versus don't drink coffee? 3 cups a day versus 1 cup a day, and so on. What else might be at stake here? What else would correlate with both lifespan and coffee consumption?
Like you drink a certain amount, you might have a health problem later down the road.
Okay. That would be kind of counterindicated here because it's claiming that we found evidence drinking coffee extends lifespan. But let me call on Jacqueline's not here. Callie? What do you think is a possible confounding variable? The age of the participants? Age is one of the things that they're measuring here. And so if that's like the response variable, that's like the output, that's the outcome that you're actually measuring, that can't really be a confounding variable that would interfere with the result or the conclusion. Tia.
Maybe like your gender?
Okay, yeah. Now we're getting somewhere. What if women live longer than men, just as a baseline? Everybody knows life expectancy for women is a little bit longer. It might also be possible that women drink more coffee than men. And so maybe the underlying cause of this correlation is just the fact that women drink more coffee and live longer. It correlates with both. Really, the reason isn't coffee extending the lifespan, it's just gender. And it happens to be correlated. That's a good idea for a confounding variable. And the next stick I drew is Anna. Do you have an idea?
Culture?
Yeah, culture. That's another great possibility for confounding variable, right? Maybe it's in, I'm just taking a guess here because I always hear about Colombian coffee beans, but maybe it's part of Colombian culture to drink a lot of coffee. But what if Colombians also have a healthier diet than the general population, right? Then it would be the Colombian culture of healthy diet that's causing the extended lifespans, and it happens to correlate with increased coffee consumption, not necessarily the coffee itself. So those are good answers. I might throw some other ones at you. One of the things the researchers posited is income. What if you make a lot of money? People who make more money tend to drink more coffee, and people who make more money have better access to healthcare, so they live longer. That's a possible reason, and it has nothing to do with the coffee, but it correlates. And another thing is your type of occupation, because if you have like a manual labor type occupation, right? If you're working as an operator out in the North Sea on an oil rig, that's a really dangerous occupation, but you probably don't have great access to coffee. By contrast, if you have a super cushy office job where you sit in your office most of the day, you're really out of harm's way, right? You're not exposing yourself to a bunch of risk. And you also have great access to coffee. So maybe that has partly to do with it. Okay, so anyways, a confounding variable is something that you ideally want to control for, because what we really want is to make a statement about whether or not coffee is good for lifespan. But there's so many confounding variables here, like culture, income level, gender, right? There's a bunch of other things at play that we would really want to control for and remove from our experiment. We talked about this for a second. An observational study can be performed retrospectively, which means that a researcher can access and analyze historical records for correlations. This is a cost-effective way of doing things because it doesn't cost any money to look at old data. I had a roommate in college who was like pre-med guy, wanted to go to med school. And one of the things he did as a side job is he looked through old hospital records. So we're talking about like 100 years ago, like prior to computers, scanned them in, and also tried to categorize the patient by diagnosis. And the whole purpose of doing that is so that they could perform some retrospective studies. on what kind of ailments were bothering people 100 years ago. Okay, when studying a population, if you select the sample in a way that is convenient to you, we call this convenience sampling. Most of the time, convenient sampling is a bad idea. Just to give you a feel for, why is that a bad idea? Let me see if I have an example in my notes. Okay, I don't have an example. Let me just come up with an example quick. What if MNU is trying to decide how to spend their money, right? Like if MNU has a little bit of extra surplus in the budget, how are they going to spend it? Are they going to spend it to improve the athletic facilities? Are they going to spend it on improving the classrooms? Are they going to spend it on extra biology lab equipment, right? This is a question that maybe you would want to survey people on. It would be really convenient for Dr. North to just walk into a biology classroom and ask all the students, hey, what should we spend the money on, right? That's convenient. It's a one-stop shop. He doesn't have to go all over campus looking for respondents. But that introduces some bias because all the biology students are going to say, yeah, we need more lab equipment. It would also be really convenient just to walk down to the basketball courts during practice and ask the basketball players, hey, what do you think we should spend money on? But they're also likely to say we should spend money on, nicer charter buses for basketball trips, right? Like it introduces bias if we choose our sample too conveniently. So what's a better way of doing things? We could index the entire population. Index means I number everybody off. So if I start numbering 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that means Maddie's index is 5, right? That's an indexed population. At MNU, we have indexed our population because you guys all have a student ID number, right? So you're an indexed population with your student ID. When you have an index list of every individual in the population, that's called a frame. And if you have a frame, you can use simple random sampling. And simple random sampling works like this. I say, I've got these individuals in my population. Alice, Bob, Charles, Darius, Edward. And I'm going to give them an index. So I'm numbering my population. And then to select individuals for my sample, I use a random number generator, right? And now I pick Edward to be part of my sample. That's a simple random sample. And that's a much better way of doing things. So even though it's way less convenient, the ideal way to survey MNU students about how to spend extra money is, well, Dr. North should sit down and use a random number generator to randomly pick student ID numbers and then email those students and follow up with them and make sure they respond to the survey. And it's more likely to get a representative overall opinion instead of just walking into the closest classroom. All right, exercise 3. Suppose you work for the local grocery store. Your boss wants to gain a better understanding of how customers feel about your store. So she's going to make you stand at the exit of the store and ask customers a series of questions about their experience. You better have at least 50 customers complete this survey throughout this week. The store opens at 7 a.m. and you want to get this chore over with so you can go back to watching your phone. The next day, you ask the first 50 customers leaving the store and you're back to watching VeggieTales by 8 a.m. Is this an example of simple random sampling or convenience sampling? Keely. Keely's not here? Oh, okay.
We're doing it by number. I don't know.
Sean, what do you think? Is it simple random or convenience?
Convenience.
Yes. It's more convenient for you to just get this over with. Ask customers back to back to back. What would it look like to do simple random sampling in this case? How would you actually do that?
Just go around the store instead of waiting at the exit.
Really, what you would need to do for simple random sampling is to have a frame, right? That's the first step in simple random sampling, is you've got to have your population and index them so that you have an index list called a frame. You probably can't do this as a grocery store, right? You probably can't get a frame for all of your customers because most of your customers, maybe they just pay in cash and they're not part of your rewards club. So, there's no way to reach out to them and figure out who went to your store this week. So it's not really possible to do strict simple random sampling. Maybe the closest thing you could do to simple random sampling is just survey one customer every hour or so over the course of a week. And that way you get about 50 customers. But it would at least be a way to reduce bias, I think, if you did one customer per hour, because maybe the evening customers are less happy than the morning customers because the produce is all picked over and nobody restocked it in the afternoon. Maybe the Tuesday customers are happier than the Saturday customers because they restock, the fish on Monday night and the store stinks on Saturday, right? So it'd be better to spread things out a little bit. Again, the moral of the story here is that convenience sampling is bad. It's really likely that you're going to introduce some kind of bias. Okay. Oh yeah, we already talked about this a little bit. We already did that example. Let's talk about a new vocabulary word. This is called systemic sampling. And it's going to sound kind of confusing, a little bit complicated. You're going to start off by guessing the population size. And then you're going to figure out your desired sample size. You're going to calculate the ratio of population size divided by sample size. Take this number and round down to the nearest integer. Generate a random number between 1 and k. And then starting with that individual, you're going to choose every kth individual for the sample. Let's make up some numbers so you can see how this is done. Suppose your population size is 1,000. Suppose your desired sample size is 50. Then the population size divided by the sample size would be 1,000 divided by 50. So that would be 20. Then we have to generate a random number between 1 and 20. Let's say that number is 7. So the list of individuals is going to be individual number 7, then number 27, then number 47, then number 67, then number 87, and so on. So there's a 20 individual gap. And you should get at least 50 of those in before you run out of people in your population. So what would it look like at the grocery store to try systemic sampling? Well, maybe you start with the 7th customer, and then you also survey the 27th customer, and you also survey the 47th customer, and you also survey the 67th customer, and so on. And it's a better way to, spread out, reduce bias. It's less convenient for sure, but With a systemic sampling method, you don't need a frame. If you want to conduct a simple random sample, you need an indexed list or a frame for your population, but for systemic sampling, the benefit is you don't actually have to have a frame for your population. So one of the big concerns that you might have when you're conducting any kind of research whatsoever is how do you reduce costs? Okay? Say the government gives you a grant to conduct your research. They say you've got $20,000 to conduct this survey. How do you stay under budget, right? How do you reduce the cost of your research? One strategy you could use to reduce costs overall is called stratified sampling. And the idea of it is like this. If I were to randomly sample, like simple random sampling, M and U students, okay, there is a chance, it's a very, very small chance, but there's a chance that even if I randomly generate student ID numbers, that every single person I pick from my sample could still be a basketball player. That's not very likely, but it is possible, right, with random chance. Stratified sampling says, what if we guarantee we're not going to do this because we are going to split up the student population into basketball players and football players and soccer players and non-athletes and so on. You break them into like major groups. And then specifically, you choose a proportional number of people for your sample from each group. That way we're guaranteeing from the start that we're not going to have all basketball players. We're not going to have all biology students, right? We're going to intentionally make sure my sample is diverse. This is called stratified sampling. So step number one, partition the population into multiple non-overlapping strata. So in my example, the basketball team would be a stratum. The soccer team would be a stratum. I'm assuming that there's nobody who plays soccer and basketball, right? These should be ideally non-overlapping. And then number two, within each stratum, you're going to either use a simple random sample or a systemic sample to choose individuals from each stratum. And again, the number of individuals, which is the subsample size, should be proportional to the stratum size. So if there are twice as many soccer players as basketball players, then they should be represented in my sample with twice as many soccer players as basketball players. Exercise 3 says, suppose you are a state representative. You must vote on a bill that would provide better funding for schools, but raise the sales tax from 8.25 to 9%. If you're a state rep, one thing that I wish they would do, they don't always do this, but is actually ask the opinion of your constituents. So let's say you conduct a survey. What would it look like to do a stratified sampling method to survey this question? Abby.
Would be like low income, like high income, that kind of thing, like sort people out.
Yeah, I really like that answer. Yeah. My strata could be like low income, middle income, high income. 3 strata. Those are non-overlapping groups. And each group, low income, middle income, high income, might be expected to respond in a way that's similar with other members of their group. Like, if you are really wealthy, maybe you really don't care that much because you know that your needs are going to be provided for, even if the sales tax increases. So who really cares? Maybe the upper income group votes together and says, yeah, let's provide better funding for schools. The flip side is, what if you are low income and it's really hard to make ends meet? Maybe that sales tax does make a big difference in like the amount of money you have available to spend, so maybe you're more likely to vote no. What's another way to stratify the population? Caleb's not here. Joseph.
It's for so the topic's over schools, right? For
Mm-hmm.
within a certain region. So could you, I don't know, divide or separate that between the difference of schools, I guess? I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, like by school district.
Yeah, district.
Yeah, that'd be a way to do it. That might produce some different opinions. Tyler.
Geographic area.
Okay. Yeah, kind of the same idea. Like which schools do they go to? What kind of values do they have in common based on location? Uh, Blake.
You can probably get different people who have kids and don't have kids going to school.
Yeah, that's the one I was waiting on. If you have kids, you probably have a much higher vested interest in whether or not the schools are well funded. So you'd expect those people would vote yes. If you don't have kids, you don't want kids, maybe you don't care, right? Maybe you're like, not my problem. So maybe you'd vote no. So you could stratify your population into people who have school-aged kids, people who don't have kids, people who have kids that are older than 18, and so on. And by splitting up the population and sampling from each group, you're making sure that everyone's opinion is represented. Cool. Another way to reduce cost. And by the way, when I say reducing cost, the stratified sample is making sure that different perspectives are included and that the random sampling method doesn't underrepresent someone. And so by doing this, we can reduce the total overall sample size. Maybe a simple random sample would be effective if my sample size was 1,000. If I switch to a stratified sampling method, I can reduce my sample size down to like 100, right? Because I have more confidence that the opinions are well represented. So that's a way to reduce sample size. And by reducing the sample size, that's how I reduce cost. Here's another way, and it's a completely opposite philosophy. But another way to do this is by cluster sampling. And clusters are like the opposite of strata, okay? They do not mean the same thing. For cluster sampling, step 1, partition the population into multiple non-overlapping clusters in which the distribution of individuals closely represents the distribution of the overall population. Then step 2, we are going to randomly select which clusters to include in the study. And notice that's different. In a stratified sample, we sample from each and every stratum. But in a clustered sample, we don't. We only sample some of the clusters and not others. Step number 3, within each cluster, we use either a simple random sample or a systemic sample. Step number 4, choose a subsample size from the cluster proportional to the cluster size. So steps number 3 and 4 are the same. But what's different is with a stratified sample, I want to stratify in ways so that each stratum votes together as a group. They have a lot of values in common. But in cluster sampling, I want each cluster to represent the population as a whole. I want to have a wide variety of opinions in each cluster. So, example, you're a US Senator, you must vote on a bill that would raise the income tax rate to provide more funding for the military. You want to seek the input of your constituents, so you conduct a survey. Stratified sampling might have you split people up into low income, middle income, high income, right? Because those people might vote a particular way, or maybe for something about the military, you might stratify into like left-leaning, independent, right-leaning, or something like that politically. But that's not what we want. We're not doing stratified. We're trying to do a cluster sample. So if you're a US Senator and you're trying to make life easier on yourself, one of the ways you could cluster sample is by taking your big region that you're supposed to represent and break it up into cities and towns, right? Each city would be a cluster. Each town would be a cluster. And then instead of traveling to every single city and every single town in the entire region, you don't. You randomly select which cities and towns to include in your study. And then instead of having to travel to 50 different cities, you only travel to 5 different cities. But you're hoping the entire time that each city is going to have a diverse range of opinions that reflects close enough in distribution to the overall population. So you're still hoping you're not leaving anybody out, but by not traveling to each and every city, you are saving effort and money and time and reducing the overall scope of your project. Okay. So pros and cons, a little summary here. Simple random sampling is an effective way to do things. The downside is that it requires a frame. A frame is a numbered list of every individual in your population, and that could cost a lot of money to create a frame. Maybe you can't create a frame. Convenient sampling is always bad. We just assume that your data is invalid if you used convenient sampling. The pros of systemic sampling, why might you choose to use systemic sampling over simple random? Well, because you don't need to create a frame. So you dodge that hassle altogether. For stratified sampling, the benefit is that if you stratify your sample well, you could reduce the overall sample size that you need to make an inference. The downside to stratified sampling is that you have to know a little bit more about your population. If I want to stratify by low income, middle income, high income, I have to know which individuals in my population belong to those groups. Maybe you know that, maybe you don't, maybe you have to find that information out, so that could also be a hassle. Cluster sampling. The upside for cluster sampling is that only traveling to a few cities, that would reduce effort and cost. The downside is that what if the cities don't each represent your entire overall population distribution, right? Like, what if some of the cities are more left-leaning and some of the cities are more right-leaning? Then by only selecting some of the clusters, you might be biasing our data. So stratified sampling and cluster sampling have opposite ideas. Stratified is saying we are going to use our additional knowledge to create better quality responses, and with better quality responses we can reduce the overall sample size to save money. Cluster sampling is saying we're going to keep a big sample size, but by putting them in clusters like cities, we're still reducing overall cost, even if we have less high quality responses. So like I said, what are the 3 main differences between clusters and strata? Intent. Are you trying to reduce the sample size and increase the quality of your responses, or are you trying to do the opposite? Coverage. We sample from every stratum in a stratified sample, but in a clustered sample, we only sample from some of the clusters. And then distribution. In a stratified sample, the individuals in each stratum think alike and think differently than the individuals in a different stratum. In a clustered sample, the people within each cluster have a variety, a diverse range of opinions that should roughly follow the distribution of the overall population. Okay, multi-stage sampling. If we have a layered type of sample where we do more than one strategy, we call this multi-stage sampling. So exercise 6 on your homework says, come up with a scenario in which a researcher wants to perform a survey. Devise a multi-stage sampling method. So I gave you an example here. And this might sound a little bit crazy, but this is the way that a lot of things work. Actually, if you've got a population as large as the United States, where we've got like 300 million people to survey, maybe this is what you do. You want to find out what proportion of Americans are in favor of legalizing marijuana, but we want to keep the budget as low as possible. First, let's partition the U.S. into regional strata. So we've got the Southwest, the Southeast, the Midwest, the East Coast, the West Coast. And these are strata because we expect them to have different opinions about this topic. And we're going to go into each stratum and say within each regional stratum, partition the cities and towns into strata based on metro area population. Because people in high population metro areas tend to think differently than people in rural areas and small towns. So that's, again, another way to stratify inside of strata. So we've got 2 layers of stratifying. Step number 3, within each region or population stratum, consider each city or town to be a cluster. Okay, so now we're doing a cluster layer. Randomly select which clusters to visit. Number 5, partition the neighborhoods of each city into home value strata. So maybe you could use a website like Zillow to figure out home values, and then you've got high home value, middle home value, low home value. You've got strata based on income or home value at least. Within each of these stratum, consider each neighborhood to be a cluster. Randomly select which neighborhoods to visit. Partition the individuals of each neighborhood into age strata, because people who are older, people who are younger have different ideas about marijuana. Within each age stratum, perform simple random sampling, go to door and speak with these individuals. So yeah, this is a lot of steps. This is a really crazy abstracted sampling method that has a lot going on here. But it's a really difficult problem to take a population of 300 million people and break it down into small enough groups where you can just go to door and ask people some questions and keep your budget low. And this way, we've made sure that we are interviewing people from every region. We're interviewing people from big cities and small towns. We are making sure we're interviewing people who are wealthy and people who are not so wealthy. We're interviewing people who are old and people who are young. We're getting an intentionally diverse group of opinions while still traveling to as few neighborhoods as possible. That's called multi-stage sampling. When an ineffective method of sampling fails to reach a representative sample of the population and returns a misleading data set, we call this sampling bias. So bias is getting a misleading data set. Exercise 7. Suppose Google were to conduct a survey to collect ratings of the Apple Maps app. They send out the survey to people using Android OS smartphones. Can you think of any type of bias that might invalidate the ratings data? Chloe. Mm-hmm. So what direction is this bias going to be in? Yeah. If you've got a bunch of Android users, they're probably using an Android device because they don't like Apple devices. So they're probably not going to be friendly to Apple software. A better way of doing this would be to make sure you're sending the survey out to people who are users of Apple devices and Android devices, right? To get a broader, more fair view of the population. Even when our sampling method reaches a representative sample of the population, you might still suffer from non-response bias. This means even though I've reached out to the right people, they still have the choice of whether or not they're going to fill out my survey. Suppose the president of MNU sends out a weekly email update. He's not 100% sure if everybody finds these emails helpful. So he decides to include a survey question at the bottom of his latest email, and it says, "Are these emails helpful?" Megan.
Could it be how seriously people are taking the survey?
Kind of.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. If this happens every week and you didn't think that his emails were useful,
Right.
are you going to keep opening the email and reading it? No. So the people who don't like those emails are never going to respond to the survey, right? They're never going to read the email, get to the bottom, and respond. He's not failing to reach out to the correct sample group. Like, he's sending the emails to everybody. He's trying to make the attempt to reach out to the correct people. But the problem is non-response. The problem is, if I really hate these emails, I'm not going to pay close attention to them. I'm not going to take the time to fill out the survey.
So then, can non-response be people choosing not to respond, but
Mhm.
people like also accidentally not responding? Like, can non-response cover both of those
Yeah.
situations?
Okay. Can you think of any ways to reduce non-response bias? Eli.
Send it out in a separate email so they see this. It's like, oh, maybe this is something that's actually important, not the same thing that I've been ignoring for the past few weeks.
Yes, that's called follow-up. If I have like a list of individuals that I'm trying to survey, and I go back and I look and some of them haven't responded to my survey, I follow up with them. I send another email, I call them, right? I go find them on campus. So that can reduce non-response bias. And there's one more way I'm thinking of. What's another way I can reduce non-response bias, Jocelyn? That's all right. I can pay people to take my survey. This is something that's actually done. Is you can offer somebody money and say, hey, I know survey is going to take, a few minutes of your time. I'll give you $10 to fill it out. I actually have an app on my phone called Google Opinion Rewards. If you download Google Opinion Rewards, they'll send you surveys and you take the survey and they send you like 50 cents. It's like not very much money, but the surveys are pretty quick. And now I've got like $30. The only downside is you can only spend it on movies. Like if you want to stream movies, like you go through and anyways. You can pay people to take surveys and that increases their response. Reduces non-response, I should say. When we get responses from our sampled group, but the responses themselves do not represent reality, we call this response bias. I'm scared to click this link because I don't remember what I put here. Here we go. Let's figure out what this says.
Your job doesn't stop. Neither do we. More than 1 million products, every industry. So Timmy, I got your blood work in, and I have a couple of questions.
Can you guys hear that? Barely. Let me see if I can turn it up.
Okay. Just about how many hot dogs do you eat a day?
How many hot dogs?
Yeah.
Geez. I don't know. I mean, some days I could eat a couple, and some days I don't eat any.
Okay. Well, let's just say for an average, take your whole week and try to figure out what your daily amount would be.
I have no idea.
No, just checking.
Okay. A whole week? Average per day would be something like, I don't know, 7?
7 hot dogs
7, yeah.
a day.
here, you know?
Sure, sure. Timmy, I want to try something if you don't mind. Walk me through one of your days.
Walk you through my day?
Yeah, just take me through a day in the life of Timmy.
Okay, well, I wake up and I take a shower, and I, get ready for work. I go downstairs and I have a bagel and something for breakfast.
And something?
A hot dog.
Hot dog. Okay.
I mean, I do usually eat a hot dog there.
Okay.
Then I take the train to work.
Well, slow down, slow down. Does anything happen on the way to work?
Oh, I almost forgot. On the way to the subway, there's a hot dog stand, so I usually have one or two.
2 hot dogs.
Yeah. I usually have 2 hot dogs before work.
So that's 3 hot dogs before work.
Right, yeah, if you're gonna count the one at home. I mean, this is all just breakfast, you know?
No, I understand. I get it.
Then I just go through my whole day of work.
Okay, hold up. Walk.
Okay. So, if you're a doctor and you ask people, like, about how much do you weigh? This question has been shown over and over again to always have a particular response bias. People will tend to lowball their body weight, even when they're talking to a doctor, even whenever there's a scale in the doctor's office and they can verify it like that, you know? When you ask people how much money they make, right? People tend to inflate that number a little bit. Like, oh, I don't exactly remember, but it's, and they'll say a number that's a few $1,000s a year greater than what they actually make. I think everybody, even subconsciously, has like a way that they think of themselves, right? Like your own internal identity, your image, and it's not purely objective, right? And so there's a lot of questions, a lot of different types of questions where you will get some bias whether or not people are intentionally doing this or unintentionally doing this. And so best practice is to try to make survey responses as anonymous as possible, right? Because people will be more likely to lie on their answers if it's not an anonymous survey and they're afraid people will think differently of them. But even on an anonymous survey, you kind of have to keep that in mind, right? That people are always going to try to put their best foot forward, if you will. When I was at Texas Tech, I was at the College of Engineering, and they would issue surveys to graduating engineering students to ask them what their starting salary will be in their new jobs. Supposed to be an anonymous survey. Everyone fills out the survey so that way they can publish stuff in their little pamphlets when they're recruiting people. They say, listen, we had like a 97% placement rate of graduating seniors into new engineering jobs, and they made on average this amount, right, of money. So people want to go to Texas Tech. Well, it was supposed to be anonymous, but one of our professors, and this is back in 2016, so this is like pre-inflation. I don't know what salaries are now. But one of the professors announced to the whole class of like 40 of us that like, man, somebody graduating this year is going to get paid $130,000. And I guess he didn't say exactly who it was. But then later, I remember being in this group talking around with people, and this guy, John, was like, I admitted, somebody asked me, was it you, John? Or are you the guy that's making 130? He was like, yeah, that's me. And people were like, wow, I can't believe you're making 130. I'm only making 90. I'm only making 95 or whatever. And it's like, that's your base salary? And he's like, well, that's not my base salary. And it's like, so does that include like your bonus? And he was like, yeah, they told me that I could get up to a $10,000 bonus, so I included that in there. I'm like, okay, so does that include like your retirement matching? And he was like, yeah, I also included my retirement matching. And does that include your benefits? And he was like, yeah. And it was like, by the time you added in all this stuff, you could call it 130,000. But really, in the end, his base salary was the same as everybody else. He was still making like 90 or 95 before his expected bonus and overtime and benefits and retirement matching and everything else. But that's just an example of response bias. He kind of answered the question with a little bit of an inflated number. Okay, in this publication, they asked 2 questions. Do you think the US should forbid public speeches against democracy? And do you think the US should allow public speeches against democracy? And the thing that I didn't type out here in my notes is that in this attitude survey, they had 100 questions. Really, really, really long survey. It took people like 15, 20 minutes to fill out the survey. So they didn't ask these 2 questions back to back. Like this wasn't question 1 and question 2. I think this might have been like question 9 and this was like question 84, right? So in the meantime, when you're answering 75 other questions, you forgot what you answered the first time you saw this, right? And even though all participants received both of these questions in their survey, 21.4% responded yes to the first question, and 47.8% of the exact same participants responded no to question 2. But do you see why that really should be the same percent? There's a pretty good number of people, something like 26% of people, that answered these 2 questions in a way that's logically contradictive, right? They're contradicting their own opinion while taking the same survey in the same day. The point this is supposed to illustrate is that the words you use when you are, constructing a survey, when you're writing a survey, influence the responses that you get. The way that you ask a question will influence the way that people answer this question, sometimes quite significantly, up to 26%. So, this is the best practice. That statisticians would recommend if you're asking a survey question. Instead of just asking, do you oppose the legalization of marijuana? You're supposed to say, do you favor or oppose? That reduces bias by just a little bit by changing the wording. In the previous example, they should have said, do you think the US should allow or forbid public speeches against democracy, right? There's another level of nuance to this, which is to say, when you're asking this question, half of your respondents should get this question, and this is the question that the other half should get. Right, in your sample, randomly choose who's going to get one or the other, but half of your respondents should get the question, do you favor or oppose the legalization of marijuana? And half of your respondents should get the question, do you oppose or favor the legalization? Because even the order of these words can subconsciously influence the response. People tend to just go with the first thing they see. Okay. The next concept here is randomize the order of the questions in your survey. You can tell about when I wrote these lecture notes a few years ago. But ideally, you don't want these 2 questions to always appear in this order, this question first, this question second, but you want to mix it up. So sometimes this one appears first and sometimes it doesn't, right? totally scramble the order of the questions in your survey. Because if I ask you, do you approve or disapprove of Joe Biden's decisions in Afghanistan, and then immediately ask about an overall performance, this was a really low popularity subject at one point in time. So if I immediately ask this question afterwards, your overall opinion is in the moment quite heavily influenced by your memory of what happened in Afghanistan, right? And so that's going to influence the way you answer the question about overall performance. Versus if you switch the order, you'll get different percentages of responses. A little bit less consequential, but if I ask you what should be the next Mountain Dew flavor, right? Scramble the order of responses, because people are more likely to just choose A, the first thing they read, than the other. So if you're doing this and you really care, swap up the order of your responses. And then in exercise 9 on your homework, as you're getting ready for the test, I suggest list 6 strategies for reducing response bias. Here's 6. Ensure that the participants believe the survey is anonymous, because if it's not anonymous, they're going to want to paint themselves in a more positive light. You'll get biased responses. Number 2, ask very detailed questions that don't leave room for interpretation. No vagueness, right? Make sure it's super clear what you're asking. Number 3, use both words, do you approve of or disapprove of kind of question. Number 4, scramble the order of those words, approve or disapprove, disapprove or approve. Number 5, scramble the order of questions overall. And then number 6, scramble the order of answer choices if you have any kind of multiple choice question appearing in your survey.